insulting me is a badge of honor for me, but I think we all know, as both as an educator for a couple decades and as a parent, using that term is just so damaging. It's hurtful. We have fought 3 decades to get this out of our schools. Kids know better than to use it. But look, this is what Donald Trump has done.
Is happening. I just don't think that you need to go the extra mile and make a claim as extreme as they're funding a terrorist group in Somalia until you have the goods, until you can actually prove that's happening. And let's also keep in mind that the US government does a good enough job stealing our money to fund foreign terror groups as it is. So maybe there should be some ire directed toward the US government.
You're really not ready for this. Kasparian just hit the gas and sent Tim Walz sliding all over the internet over an alleged Somali fraud scandal. Receipts start flying, sarcasm hits hard, and those sharp side eyes say more than words ever could. Narratives flip in real time, excuses crumble, and the spin cycle completely falls apart. Is this political commentary, a perfectly timed takedown, or the moment everything begins to unravel? Grab the popcorn, study your jaw, and watch what happens when serious questions meet real pressure. Because silence doesn't stay quiet, it gets loud, fast, and impossible to forget.
Minnesota in particular.
At first it was Minnesota, but then it was later reported.
It's all 50 states?
All 50 states, they have to provide evidence that,
Oh, I didn't realize that he brought it in.
Yeah, so basically law-abiding,
okay, maybe
child
that's a little bit overboard. I thought it was 100%. Just that state.
Yeah, that is overboard. I want to be clear about something. Due to the massive amount of COVID aid that flowed into states across the country, fraud has been a problem, not just in Minnesota, but all across the country. In fact,
If you're enjoying this, please subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you might realize. The moment Kasparian turns her focus toward Tim Walz, the tone shifts fast. From calm political analysis to a carefully controlled demolition, delivered with a smile, a pile of context, and a completely ruthless sense of irony.
Off of something that broke earlier this year in November. There was a huge story that was published in the New York Times about fraud cases in the Minneapolis area. And most of these, nonprofits or these little businesses that were popping up and basically benefiting from COVID era public money were Somali owned. Now, 2 things are happening at the same time. On one hand, these fraud cases appear to be very serious and very real.
This isn't a debate, not a back and forth, and definitely not a simple misunderstanding fixed with a polite nod. This is a one-way showdown where Tim Walz is buckled into the passenger seat of his own talking points, while Kasparian calmly drives them straight off the cliff of credibility.
Here, another day. Okay, so a YouTuber named Nick Shirley uncovered tens of, arguably even he claims $100 million of fraud in Minnesota under Governor Tim Walz's.
Tim Walz walks into this situation wearing the familiar look of the reliable Midwestern leader, the kind of politician who seems like he should be explaining crop rotation or praising a high school marching band.
The bad faith actors who might be using this for terrible political purposes, the fact remains that it appears that close to $9 billion, according to prosecutors, have been stolen from taxpayers in the Minneapolis area as a result of these fraudulent businesses. And I want to give you more details about it in just a second. But before I do, Cenk, your 2 cents.
Unfortunately for him, that wholesome image doesn't turn into armor when uncomfortable questions start lining up like unpaid bills. Kasparian wastes no time treating that image as decoration, not substance. Because good vibes aren't a replacement for real competence when oversight begins to wobble. The Somali fraud scandal doesn't slip quietly into the story, and Anna makes sure of that, framing it as the obvious elephant in the room that Tim Walz keeps insisting is just a decorative ottoman. His repeated claims that everything is under control start to sound less like reassurance and more like wishful thinking, especially when control seems to mean hoping no one asks follow-up questions. Kasparian never raises her voice or slams the desk, because the facts do the heavy lifting, while the sarcasm handles the cleanup.
To be under the assumption, and this was, I guess, a terrible assumption to have because it's not true, that there would be a recalibration of some of these policies in order to actually serve the best interests of the American people. But what I've noticed, certainly on a local level, is that there's absolutely no self-reflection, no recalibration of said policies. And on a national level, there seems to be more interest in serving the egos and, the narcissism of, Democratic leadership.
Every attempt to soften the issue with bureaucratic language gets treated like a magician's endless scarf trick. It looks impressive until you realize it just keeps going. Tim Walz's dependence on process explanations and administrative complexity turns into a running punchline. Not because the process doesn't matter, but because repeating it starts to feel like hiding behind a filing cabinet. Anna Kasparian cuts through this move with surgical precision, making it clear that complexity doesn't erase responsibility, and confusion isn't the same as innocence. The roast sharpens when she leans into the gap between Tim Walz's carefully polished public image and the reality of leadership under pressure. This is the same Tim Walz known for calm authority and moral clarity, yet suddenly that clarity feels hard to find when the spotlight hits an uncomfortable place. Anna treats the contradiction like a textbook case of political branding gone sideways, where the label promises transparency, but the contents are strangely opaque. The humor ramps up as the explanations keep stacking, each one more abstract than the last, until the whole defense sounds like a group project where no one wants to admit they forgot their part. Anna Kasparian points out how every new clarification somehow creates even more questions, turning reassurance into a subscription service nobody signed up for. Tim Walz isn't cast as some mastermind villain here, but as something that might be worse in politics. A leader who seems genuinely surprised that accountability has a memory.
Emphasize childcare centers where Shirley shows up during weekday business hours to find that there are actually like no children present. There are also some pretty extreme claims that we need more evidence for, which I'll get into in just a second. So a claim was just kind of casually made about how this money is then being siphoned off and sent over to Al-Shabaab, a terrorist group that operates out of Somalia. Now, there hasn't been any evidence provided for.
As the roast keeps rolling, Anna Kasparian zooms out just enough to make one thing clear. This isn't an attack on a community. No matter how hard some narratives try to steer the conversation elsewhere, the Somali community is not the target here. If anything, they're the ones caught in the fallout of administrative failure and political deflection. Anna makes it painfully clear that using marginalized communities as shields isn't just ineffective, it's insulting, especially when the real issue is oversight and responsibility at the top. Tim Walz's broader record naturally drifts into the spotlight, not as a distraction, but as context that makes the situation feel even more absurd. This is a governor often praised for steady leadership in times of crisis, someone framed as a calm and reliable hand, now struggling to explain why basic questions suddenly feel like personal attacks. Anna treats that irony like a gift, reminding the audience again and again that leadership isn't measured by how smooth things are when everything's fine, but by how directly problems are handled when they're not. The critique turns especially sharp when Anna looks at the media ecosystem surrounding Tim Walz, where silence and downplaying the issue seem more strategic than accidental. Coverage that tiptoes around the controversy comes off as less like journalism and more like reputation management, as if ignoring the problem might make it quietly go away. Anna Kasparian skewers that approach, pointing out that selective outrage is still outrage, especially when it conveniently shows up for a fundraiser.
The Department of Health and Human Services has decided to effectively punish all childcare centers in the state of Minnesota by halting federal childcare payments toward the state. And of course, this is over allegations that some of these childcare centers are engaging in fraud. Now, Deputy HHS Secretary Jim O'Neill said in a post on X that funds will be released only when states prove they are being spent legitimately.
Meanwhile, Tim Walz's statements, filtered through layers of caution and legal carefulness, come across as a masterclass in saying a lot while actually committing to nothing. Anna Kasparian treats this verbal gymnastics with clear disdain, showing through her tone and phrasing that real leadership requires more than dodging verbs that suggest responsibility. His constant references to investigations, reviews, and ongoing processes start to feel like a lullaby meant to lull the public into ignoring the problem. Anna then shifts to the idea of trust, not as a sentimental notion, but as political currency that loses value fast when mishandled. Tim Walz's trust deficit isn't painted as a single catastrophic failure, but as a slow buildup of moments where clarity was optional and evasiveness was convenient. Anna's sarcasm hits hardest here, exposing how easily trust is treated as renewable, even when the evidence says otherwise. Other parts of his governance come under the microscope too. from policy priorities to past statements on accountability and ethics. These aren't brought up nostalgically but ironically, as reminders of standards that now seem inconvenient. Anna Kasparian makes the contrasts sting, letting Tim Walz's own carefully cultivated values quietly condemn the current situation, without ever needing to make a direct accusation.
So over and over again, you'll see them go visit various childcare facilities and you'll see that there's no one there are no children. And sometimes they'll find workers there and they'll ask some questions. The workers are very evasive. And I should note that while, yes, it is true that prosecutors have already been investigating similar fraud cases in the area, and there have already been arrests. What's important to know about the businesses that were visited by Shirley and David here, we're still receiving.
The Somali fraud scandal stays at the center of the roast, coming back again and again, not as needless repetition, but as a reminder that unresolved issues don't just disappear. Anna Kasparian makes it clear that unanswered questions don't expire, no matter how confidently they're ignored. Tim Walz's hope that time will fix what transparency hasn't is treated as an optimistic but flawed strategy. As the roast moves forward, Anna breaks down the idea that criticism equals hostility, framing skepticism as a basic expectation, not a personal attack. Tim Walz's defensive stance comes across as a misunderstanding of his role, as if accountability were optional rather than essential. The humor stays sharp but controlled, never chaotic, because the facts speak for themselves. Later, the tone shifts subtly from relentless satire to a quiet warning wrapped in irony. Anna points out that political careers aren't usually ended by a single scandal, but they can be slowly eroded by how those scandals are handled. Tim Walz isn't declared finished, but he's shown wobbling under the weight of his own non-answers. The roast moves forward without flashy theatrics, relying instead on the quiet, devastating truth that branding can't outrun reality forever. Anna leaves Tim Walz standing in the aftermath, still in office, still smiling, but undeniably diminished by his refusal to face scrutiny head-on.
Indicating that certain requirements would need to be met before federal grants are approved for childcare programs in all states, not just Minnesota. With that in mind, let's take a look at what he had to say.
I have activated our Defend the Spend system for all ACF childcare payments across America. Starting today, we require a justification, receipt, or photo evidence before we make a payment. Second, I've just signed and sent a demand letter to Governor Walz. I required a full 360 review.
The audience is left entertained, informed, and fully aware that this wasn't just a conversation. It was a complete takedown, packed with enough sarcasm to sting and enough substance to stick. What makes the roast hit so hard is how Anna Kasparian refuses to let Tim Walz hide behind the comfortable fog of respectability politics, where titles and past achievements are supposed to act like diplomatic immunity. She treats his office not as a shield, but as an amplifier, because the higher the position, the louder unanswered questions resonate. Every attempt to pivot to legacy or intention gets gently but firmly brought back to consequence, as if Anna is reminding everyone that sincerity is no substitute for accountability. The longer the spotlight stays on him, the more Tim Walz's strategy starts to look like a man rearranging furniture during a fire drill, convinced that if everything looks orderly enough, no one will notice the smoke. Anna sharpens this image, showing how repetition has replaced resolution, turning official reassurances into mere background noise. Promises of reviews and audits start to sound less like real action plans, and more like a playlist designed to stall until public attention drifts elsewhere. She also drives home a tougher truth. Political decline rarely comes with fireworks anymore. Instead, it creeps in quietly through a slow erosion of credibility. Tim Walz isn't shown collapsing under scandal, but gradually sinking into the kind of skepticism that follows a leader long after headlines fade. This is the skepticism that resurfaces at every press conference, every policy announcement, and every carefully polished statement about ethics and responsibility.
Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Children, Youth, and Families said none of the 10 childcare centers that YouTuber Nick Shirley recently visited for his viral video had their payments paused, although a couple were previously closed down by the state, and state workers are doing visits to the rest today. So these facilities, even though there was prior knowledge by the state that there was fraud going on, these facilities were still receiving these government grants.
The chaos sharpens even further when Anna Kasparian quietly contrasts Tim Walz with the expectations ordinary people face. When everyday citizens mishandle funds or oversight, consequences come fast and without mercy. Yet in politics, similar mistakes are often treated as teachable moments instead of breaches of trust. Anna's sarcasm points out this imbalance without raising her voice, showing that accountability seems to soften the closer it gets to power. As the story unfolds, Tim Walz's constant insistence on calm authority starts to feel less reassuring and more rehearsed, like a fire extinguisher demo given while the building is already smoldering. Anna frames this calm not as confidence, but as insulation, a way to keep distance between leadership and responsibility. The message is clear. Steadiness without substance is just stillness pretending to be strength. The roast also digs into a common political misconception, that endurance equals vindication, that surviving controversy is the same as overcoming it. Anna dismantles this idea by showing that unresolved questions don't disappear just because elections pass or approval ratings hold steady. Tim Walz may still be in office, but his narrative now carries an asterisk that refuses to be edited out.
Unclear what he means by the photo evidence. Like what is that going to prove? He says upon receipt of payment. What do you want a photo of? Do you want photos of children at the daycare centers? I don't know. There was a lack of clarity there. I personally don't have any problem whatsoever with increased oversight of how public money is being spent, because it is true that fraud is a problem, not just in Minnesota, but fraud has been a huge problem in many states, as I've mentioned, California being one of them, because there was this massive infusion of COVID era money from the federal government to the states in order to keep people whole as, shutdowns were taking place and people were losing their jobs. That's always going to, unfortunately.
Even the silence around certain details becomes part of the critique, as Anna Kasparian treats omissions like statements in their own right. What isn't addressed becomes just as telling as what is repeated, turning gaps into accusations without ever spelling them out. Tim Walz's reluctance to face specifics is framed as a choice, not a limitation. And choices, once noticed, tend to follow leaders everywhere. As the roast moves toward its closing, Anna drives home that leadership isn't about avoiding mistakes, it's about confronting them before they grow into distrust. Tim Walz's handling of the Somali fraud scandal is shown as a warning of what happens when image management outruns transparency. The sarcasm brings laughter, but it fades into a quiet discomfort that lingers long after the jokes land. The final stretch of the takedown doesn't offer a neat ending, because unresolved controversies rarely do. Anna leaves Tim Walz suspended between authority and accountability, where charisma can't outrun scrutiny and patience thins with every recycled explanation. The roast doesn't burn everything to the ground, but it leaves unmistakable scorch marks, reminding everyone that silence, deflection, and carefully chosen words are never neutral, especially when public trust is on the line.